Welcome to Emphasis Added, a podcast brought to you by the Houston Law Review about legal issues, prominent lawyers, and the study and practice of law. I'm Harrison Little.
And I'm Jake Guarino, and we are your hosts for Season 5. Thank you for joining us.
We're joined here today by Kaileigh Mallin, the current editor-in-chief of the Houston Law Review, and Chandni, Jaggi, the current diversity, equity, and inclusion editor of the Houston Law Review. We figured the best way to start this off is just by giving you both an opportunity to introduce yourselves. So, Kaileigh, why don't you start off and tell us a little bit about what you did this summer, what your career interests are, and I guess your current trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent actually the last 2 summers at Norton Rose Fulbright. I work primarily with the litigation team, doing different areas of litigation, but I'm hoping to practice with the commercial litigation team next year. I really like energy law. It's very interesting. So Houston is a great area for that. You know, a lot of our commercial stuff focuses in the energy industry. And I've had a chance to work with we have a specific energy litigation team as well, who I've done a lot of work with. And so I'm excited to get started.
Excellent. What about you, Chandni?
So I spent the past 2 summers at Vinson Elkins, and we'll be starting there next fall as an associate, and I am hoping to go into litigation. I struggled a little picking transactional versus litigation, but I think I finally made my decision. There are pros to both, but I'm hoping to join the litigation group next fall.
Wonderful. And so on top of that, would you mind giving just a little general background about yourself, essentially what led you to law school?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a little bit of a weird path to get here. I am from Maine originally, so definitely not a native Texan, but trying my best. And my undergraduate degree is in environmental studies and sustainability, but I did have a pre-law minor. So I knew pretty early that I was at least interested in the law arena. I just wasn't sure exactly what that would look like or if that would end up being my end game. So I started out in a law firm for a year after I graduated, and it was a very heavily transactional practice, and I realized it wasn't necessarily my cup of tea. And that was really personally my only interaction with law, so I pivoted and I spent about 4.5 or so years in the nonprofit world. I was doing development, so grant writing and fundraising, galas and stuff like that. And when the pandemic hit, I just realized that I wanted something a little more challenging. I had already taken the LSAT a couple of years before that, so it was still kind of on my horizon, but I really wanted to be sure before I went to law school that it was for sure what I wanted to do. So once the pandemic hit, I looked at my life, as a lot of us did, and I just decided that law school was definitely something that I wanted to do. I really wanted to be a lawyer, and that's how I got here. You know, my husband's an attorney, so he's in the energy industry as well. So he was looking at the Houston market anyway. So I applied to U of H and obviously got in. The rest is history there.
And here you are.
Yeah.
Excellent. What about you, Chandni?
Mine is also similar in that I had a bit of a winding road getting to law school. So I went to undergrad. I thought I was going to be pre-med, biology, quickly realized OChem was not for me, as many people realize. And so I pivoted and I got my master's of public health. After undergrad, so I decided to go into public health, got my master's in public health and epidemiology. In undergrad, I did consider law for a little bit. I worked at one law firm over a summer. It was an oil and gas, very small law firm. It just wasn't a fit for me, so then I kind of wrote off law altogether. Then I got my master's of public health, worked in epidemiology for a few years, and similar to Kaileigh, I then started to reevaluate my life. COVID hit. I was like, what do I actually want to be doing? I kind of was like, well, I think I want to move into a practice where I get to work with people more personally. So in public health, in epidemiology, I was like on my computer, on Excel, coding all day. And I was like, I just want to interact with people. I want to be in a field where I get more person-to-person interaction, and I feel like I'm really helping them. And so I was like, maybe law school is for me. And I also wanted to move back to Houston, and I was living in Atlanta, but my husband and I's families are both in Houston. So I applied to U of H, got in, and here I am.
It's interesting that both of y'all had some amount of exposure to the law beforehand and then walked away from it and then eventually found your way back.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, interaction with the law, if you will, it did pull me away, but ultimately it was really helpful coming back into law school because I definitely knew I didn't want to be in that specific area of law. So it gave me a little bit more direction, and it did also push me a little bit more towards the litigation side. So I didn't know for sure when I came in that litigation was it. But I actually attended a panel when we were all 1Ls that was like a pick your practice group and had some attorneys speaking on it. And when the litigator was talking about, doing research and putting puzzles together and fitting all of that into, like a brief or a motion, it really just resonated with me. And it's something that as I've gotten exposure to it over my 2 summers working at NRF has just really solidified, and I'm really excited to do that.
Well, I guess with all of that said, how about we transition more into our discussion for today?
First of all, thank you both for joining us today. Law school can be such an overwhelming experience when you first start because there's so much going on, from every different direction. You've got cases, you've got class prep, you've got studying, you've got exams, you've got outlining. It just kind of overwhelms the 1Ls. So to that effect, we sent out a poll last week asking the 1Ls, what do you want to know? We got 2 awesome women here talking to us today about class prep, studying, community involvement, and summer employment. So to that effect, how do you read? How do you prepare for class? What does that process look like for each of you?
So for me, and I first want to specify, it is super individual. So I think that what works for one person does not work for the next person. So first, you should not compare yourself to what everybody else is doing because everybody reads at different speeds. They process at different speeds. I need to take my time with reading. So for me, it was a bit of a longer process. So I would read. Book briefing was my best friend. So, and if you don't know what book briefing is, it's just where you highlight the different portions of the case in different colors. So I'd highlight the facts in yellow and the issue in orange. And then I would go back and type up my brief or handwrite. And normally I was handwriting because, again, that's how I process information. So it was a longer engagement period, which is frustrating when I was trying to get through all of my different classes and there was so much reading. But at the end of the day, it's what I needed to do for me to fully understand and feel prepared for class. But that being said, I think one thing that I learned while going through the first month or so is not every professor is looking for the same thing. So one way of cutting down a little bit is you focus on the things that the professor is looking for. So some professors care a lot about the procedural history, like your Civ Pro professor. But your torts professor may not care at all what happened in prior courts. Then you don't need to focus on that when you're reading. And so that can kind of help speed things along. But that was the process that worked for me.
Kaileigh, how did you develop your reading skills?
I was fortunate. As I said, I had a pre-law minor, so I've taken law classes before, obviously on a very different level in undergrad than it is when you get to law school. But I at least had, gone through and read cases before, had discussions about them. So I had a little bit better idea of what I was looking for and what the different sections were. I had briefed cases in undergrad, which I think a lot of first-year students don't even know how to do. So I do feel like I came in with a little bit of an edge, which was super helpful. But for me, the biggest thing was just making sure that I did the reading. I know a lot of us in undergrad, you can kind of skate by a little bit without fully reading, but there's so much in these cases, and it's really hard sometimes when you're a 1L to know what's important or not. As Chandni said, different professors are going to care about different things, and until you have gone through several weeks in their class, you may not even know what that is, and it can change from week to week, from topic to topic, what's important and what's not. I found that making sure that I knew what we were focusing on in the class would kind of change and complement how I was reading for that particular class. As you're going through Civ Pro and you're focusing on different areas of the case projection, you focus on different things in your reading and want to be aware of different things in your reading. So just looking at that out your syllabus and where you might be in your outline should really inform how you're doing your reading and making sure that you're on pace with the class.
When it comes from translating your reading notes into actually being in class, getting cold calls, wanting to answer questions, not necessarily wanting to be kind of a nuisance in class, because that can be a concern sometimes. How do you translate your reading notes to your lecture notes, and what's the difference in between the two?
So I am someone who compiled them all together. So I would have my reading notes up during class, and then I would add in track changes my class notes. So then that was really helpful going back through when I was translating my class notes and my reading notes into outlines, because I could go through and see exactly what I had added with class, what the professor had said versus what was just my reading, and compile that into something a little sleeker for an outline. I think I know a lot of people use like OneNote or something where they have all of their class notes all together. I'm someone who I create a new document for every class, and then I just title them by the date, so I can go through and like pick out specific classes, like, oh, what were we doing that particular day, and I can pull it up. So that kind of filing system worked well for me as well.
So kind of similar, which I don't think is normal, but maybe it is. I also took notes on my reading notes. So for me, I usually would handwrite my briefs. And so then I would handwrite lecture notes on top of my briefs. And especially 1L, when so much of your reading is case reading, which changes a little 2L and 3L, but especially 1L, you're reading a lot of cases. So I would have my brief in front of me, and then I would just take lecture notes on top of it. And I would just write in a different color. So again, I would know, like, these are my lecture notes versus these are my reading notes. But I just had it all together in one document as well. Which again I think made it easier when I was outlining, because I had just one thing I could look at. I could see what was emphasized, what I thought was important versus what the professor thought was important, and take it all together and look at the case holistically.
So it sounds like both Kaileigh and Chandni have a pretty similar approach to how you did it, basically putting lecture notes on top of the reading notes that you took beforehand.
Very similar. I actually did the exact same thing, except I got pretty neurotic with it, and I've got keyboard controls for every, like, green, red, blue, every single highlighter color, every single text color. I am a color coding demon, kind of like what you're talking about with your case reading. What about you, Harrison?
So I took kind of a different approach to all three of y'all, I think. I practically dictate everything the professor says. I just take extremely extensive lecture notes to kind of an obsessive degree, but I've just found that that's what works for me personally. And I think you touched on a very important point, Chandni, which is these habits are going to vary person to person. What may work for me and what may work for Jake may not work at all for another person. And so I think the goal of this discussion is to just highlight the variety of ways you can go about doing a variety of things as a 1L to find success. And I think you also made a very important point, Kaileigh, which is that just you have to do the readings. Quimby is useful to a degree. You can also lean on outlines that you've received from friends and even have your peers help you out from time to time, but nothing can supplement, or nothing rather can replace just how much material you get from actually doing the readings.
Yeah. Something actually that I liked to do was use Quimby. I would watch, the Quimby videos or look at the briefs before I did the reading, and then I would go through the case and do the reading, and that really helped me pick out exactly from the case, especially the old ones that have a lot of really old English phrases that can just be a monster to actually sit down and figure out what they're trying to say. You get the meat and bones really from the Quimby video or from the brief that they have, and then you go through, you still do the reading, but you can use that to show you where you're looking for things in the actual case itself.
Yeah, and then and again, that goes back to how everybody has to figure out what works best for them. I did the opposite. So if I didn't understand a case, I would read it. I would not really know what's happening. I'd take some notes, and then I'd watch the Quimby video, and then I'd be like, oh, that's how it all like works together. And especially for some of those like old like contracts cases or old Civ Pro cases that the writing is just hard to understand, I would then go back afterwards and watch the Quimby videos, which are incredibly helpful and a great resource. But I mean, as everybody has said, you should definitely read still.
Yeah. It's an excellent supplement, I think is kind of the gist of it, but it can't replace the value of reading.
Because you don't really know all the time if what's in the Quimby brief is entirely accurate. I was in class yesterday, and I had my Quimby pulled up for a case that we're talking about, and the professor was talking about all these very important substantive points of environmental law, while the Quimby brief was all just the procedural history. It was just why the case was dismissed on procedural grounds, even though there was a ton of different, laws were overturned. It was new Supreme Court precedent, and it was like very recent as well. I personally use Quimby to, like during 1L at least, to prepare for cold calls. If your professor's asking you for the facts, those videos are super helpful. but you cannot replace the reading and just doing it. It might be a slog at first, but it does get better because you do get more efficient. One tip that one of my buddies told me is that he skips the meat of the case at the outset, finds the court's conclusion, reads the conclusion to understand, what's the point of this, why am I reading it, and then goes back through the case and rereads the whole thing, picking out individual points of like, okay, this is the reasoning, this makes sense, I understand this because I know what the whole point of this 20-page sometimes case is, really working towards and why we're getting taught it in the end.
That's something that I wish I had done more of whenever I was a 1L, just picking out the conclusion at the outset so that you can see how everything else builds to that. Mm-hmm. You can obviously see clues sometimes to see how the court is going to hold on an issue, but I do think that really helps you read more effectively.
Yeah, they do like a plot twist sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I guess transitioning into our next subject, outlining, this is another one of those things that's inherently subjective. People outline in a variety of different ways. So I guess I want to hear from the two of y'all how y'all go about outlining, synthesizing your reading notes with your lecture notes, whether your outlines tend to be more streamlined and big picture, or whether they go into excruciating detail. So you want to tell us a little bit about that, Chandni?
Sure. So I had all intentions of being that person who outlined throughout the semester. And your professors will tell you that's a great approach, and it probably is. However, I was never successful in that because I took my reading and briefing very seriously, and there's just not enough time to do everything. Realistically, you just cannot do it all. And so for me, I was like, I just don't have time to outline right now, and I really want to make sure that I'm prepared for class and understanding everything that's happening. So starting first semester, and now it's proved true for all 4 semesters, I will outline basically the last month of the semester. So I started outlining in November, I started outlining in April. And it worked really well for me personally because I was able to then review everything basically the month leading up to the final. And I would go back to the beginning and just re-teach myself everything and make sure I understand everything. And my method to outlining is I would try to find an A outline. I'd have that open. I'd have my lecture notes open, reading notes open. And then I would type up my own outline, synthesizing the material in those. So I wouldn't use an old outline as my outline itself, but I would use it to help me make sure I was capturing everything. If I missed something in class, I'd go to the old outline if they captured it better, or if they worded something in a way that makes sense to me or helps me understand the material. Usually my outline was a little shorter. It wasn't short, but I noticed compared to some of my friends, they'd be like, oh, my outline's 150 pages. And I'd be like, cool, mine's 40. So I think I did a mix. I would include some case information, but usually not a ton unless the professor's I really want you to have cases. Then I would generally focus on this is the rule. This is how to apply the rule. These are the exceptions to the rule. And I think my outlines I kept more streamlined, which just worked for me and how I understood material.
I probably lean heavier on the side of starting early, but I don't typically start too early. I think 1L, I was a lot better at doing that. As you get later on in law school, I think some of the study habits relax a little bit, unfortunately for us at the moment. I tailor my outlines very specifically to the class. So something that I think is important is knowing how your final is going to work, because we had, at least for our section, I think only one final that was fully closed book. We were allowed to have one paper, I think, of notes that we could use. So my outline for that class was very different from an outline for a class where we had a 3-hour open book, open note final, or 3 or 4 hours. And that outline was very different from a class where we had a 12-hour take-home final. So I think knowing how your final works and how you are able to work within that time frame is super helpful. So my contracts final, which was the closed book, you only have one paper, that one was a lot more streamlined, a lot more here's the rule, here's the exception, without a lot of case details, because that's how that professor wanted that final written. And that allowed me, as I was doing practice exams, to go through and figure out, okay, where did I go wrong? Where did I go right? Did I get these exceptions? Did I find these things? Rather than, in Civ Pro, where we had 12 hours, I think mine was closer to maybe 150. It was not 150 pages long, but it was at least 100, I think, because I had, snippets that I thought were important from cases, so I could, rely on them. I had a lot more under every rule, these were all the cases that we read. These were some really great lines they had in them. I still have thick binders at my house of every single class I've taken with all my outlines printed out and tabbed pretty aggressively. But that's just something that works for me. If I have it in front of me as I'm doing my studying, I write things down in the margins that I've missed or that I want to remember as I'm going forward. I do also aggressively color code them, make sure that all my sections are apart, because even if you don't go back and look at them while you're doing your exam, which a lot of, the 3-hour, 4-hour exams, you're not really going to have the time. As you're going through and doing the color coding and the highlighting and the tabbing and making sure that everything is in the perfect spot, you just kind of inherently learn it better, I think. Mm-hmm. So I was also someone, I didn't just rely on other people's outlines from years before or anything like that. I think the process of doing it is so, so crucial, especially your first year, to actually learning the material and how it all fits together.
So I did something very similar to you, where I would also print out my outlines. I would highlight them. I would mark them up with, I had like my pink pen, and that was my outline pen, and I would like mark it up with pink. And for me, I thought I remembered it more. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't, but it worked, and it's superstitious now, so I have to use the same pink pen. But I would tab it, and I would really interact with the document, and I think that really helped. And then I would go through after I'd interact with it, and then I'd go revise my outline. So I'd maybe take things out. If something was like repetitive, I would remove it. I was like, oh, actually, like this rule kind of makes sense with this rule, so I want to move it up. And so I made it a really interactive process, and I think that really helped me engage with the material and learn the material even more.
Yeah.
Engaging in learning material, that is so, so crucial, because if you use someone else's outline, even if it is a outline, you're really just reading someone else's work. You're not processing it. You're not putting things in your own words. Similar to if you're taking like a practice exam. I remember taking a practice exam almost every weekend after the start of October, and my study group would get together. We'd go through, simulate test conditions, manipulate our outlines, use it, apply it, get really familiar with using those rules and using those analyses on the fly. And come test day, you're infinitely more familiar with your the content of your class, as opposed to just using someone who's, maybe they got a good grade, but maybe they got that good grade because they were doing all of these, incremental steps to learn their material. What about you, Harrison?
Well, I think I've seen two common threads here so far. One, y'all are similar in that y'all went out of y'all's way to make your outline your own. Mm-hmm. That y'all might have had very different approaches. It might have been more streamlined, or it might have been at times 150 pages or something like that. But at the end of the day, y'all were color coding it, y'all were writing in them and making it your own. And the other thread that I saw is that you're revisiting your outlines. You're not just typing them up once and not looking at them again until, say, the week before the final. I think both of those are absolutely crucial in order to make the most out of your outline. That's what I saw.
I think it's important to not be afraid to overhaul and completely redo the entire structure of your outline. For contracts specifically, our professor had a very specific way that he wanted you to work through the problems, and it wasn't, a lot of classes, I think I've been able to look at the syllabus and use that as a general guide for the way my outline looks, because you do kind of have the buckets that everything goes into. But for our contracts class, you could not go by the syllabus. It was not helpful, I think, in going through and structuring your answers. So I believe I overhauled my contracts outline at least 3 times to make sure that I had all the things, at least in my mind, that were in the correct order, that was enough where I felt like, okay, I've structured this in such a way that I won't forget this on the exam.
For me, it was so important during 1L, especially first semester, because, coming from undergrad, I did treat it like I was studying for an undergrad exam, which is just fundamentally a flawed way to go about it. And so I would get lost in trying to format my outline to look great so I could go through it and move through it quickly. Mm-hmm. But I spent way too much time messing with my number system, my dots and dashes, my tables, my highlighting colors, my fonts and everything, that I was so devoted to putting my time into formatting, the actual substantive content wasn't there. And so that did hurt me on one of my exams during my first year, because it was like, I just wanted it to look great so I could feel good about it, whereas that's not how you get a good grade in law school.
I would have to fight that same inclination to sit down on a Friday and, rather than mess with formatting for an hour and a half, to actually deal with the substance for that time. So aside from using your outlines to study, what was your preferred study method in terms of, did you have a study group as a 1L, or did you prefer to study individually?
So I did a study group, but I used the study group very sparingly. So I did not use a study group throughout the whole semester, only when we only used the study group to go through our outlines to make sure that we had everything in our outline that was talked about in class. So like maybe the 2 weeks leading up to finals we met, and it was a small group. It was only 4 of us, and we would just go through each of our outlines, go through the material, make sure it's all there. And then we did go over some practice essays together. But for the most part, I was doing individual study. I know myself and I get distracted. I end up chatting. It's not an effective use of my time. I can be talkative. So I was like, I need to study by myself. So I just used the study group at the very end of the semester, and it worked well for me.
I think I took a more hybrid approach than that. The way that I work generally, I like to do sort of the legwork on my own individually and then bounce my ideas off of a group. And I think I did that throughout the semester, and especially as we were doing practice exams, circling up with a group after you do it on your own to see what did you get that I might have missed, what did I get that you might have missed. And I didn't just study with one specific group. I kind of bounced around and studied with a bunch of different people, which I thought was really helpful because everyone has such a different take on everything, and so getting everyone's perspectives and bouncing different ideas off of different people was super helpful in forming a really well-rounded idea of like what the concepts in the class was.
What was your approach, Jake?
Kind of the same way that Kaileigh did it. I tried at first to work with a group of about 6 people, so similarly a small group. One thing that I noticed pretty early on is how quickly we went from, being on task, being efficient, going over our cases, really distilling the information and just using it, talking it through, to, okay, let's go talk about football, or let's go talk about, gossip, or let's go just like complain about our reading or whatever we've got on our plate right now. And so the biggest thing for me was balancing, all right, that social aspect, because I do learn better if I'm able to talk things through, just because I'm a big believer that if you can teach something, you know it well enough to use it, and then that's when you really know that you're in a good place. So I use the balancing approach, where it was more, got my readings, distill everything the way that I think it works, and then, get a couple of people that I trust will be on task with me and that have the same kind of approach that I did in terms of like, business right now. Let's go and get good grades. What about you?
I studied almost completely alone. That being said, whenever I'd have conversations, I remember with like my mom or my dad or my grandmother, they'd always want to know how law school is going. So I'd always be explaining concepts to them when I'm on the phone. So I guess that was my experience teaching other people.
It's funny you say that because I did the same thing, but with my daughter. I was like, if I can explain this to a 7-year-old and have her understand it, I've boiled it down to the basic enough elements where I've got this. And I can just, apply this to any situation. So that's funny that you mentioned that. She got really into it, too. She was like, Mom, tell me another one of your, law stories. I want to, let's get into it. So that was fun, yeah. So
you're telling me your daughter's going through law school at 7 years old?
Pretty much, yeah. She's also editor-in-chief.
Got to start them young at some point, right? So in terms of going from studying with your study group, outlining, you've got all your materials, when it comes down to test day, how do you guys write your best exam answers? Do you have any tips for 1Ls if they're going and seeing a fact pattern, how to translate that fact pattern to an A on their exams?
And again, it does differ a little bit based on the amount of time you have, if you're open note, open book, if it's a completely closed book. But something that I do consistently is I will read through an exam and not touch it, just with my eyes, read through everything, start to, that you have the little formula in your head of what you think the issues might be, what a grand idea of what's going on. And then I would go back through and I would highlight and I would pick out facts that I thought were, specific to certain maybe causes of action, whatever it is that you're issue spotting. I would highlight them. Only highlight, and then I would go back through and I would look at my highlighted sections and I would write what box I thought those facts would go into. So that was really helpful for me because once you go through that whole process, you can look at your exam, see all of the things that you need to hit, and then you start the outline process. You are outlining your exam. So I take all of those boxes of the issues that I spotted and I would write all of those as sort of headings, and then I was able to take the headings, pop the rules in that I knew, bring exactly the facts in that I had highlighted, So you kind of go through that IRAC on a very cyclical basis, and then start to do my analysis after I had all of that stuff down already. And then obviously, conclude however you see fit.
So I would read through the different prompts. And so like for the first question, while I would read through it, I would circle anything that looked like it could be related to an issue. So like if there's a contracts exam and it says that there is, or like in a torts exam, for example, they would say like, oh, so-and-so crashed into so-and-so. I'd circle that and be like, okay, there could be an issue. Is there like a negligence issue? Like, what is it? Or if I saw something else and I'd be like, oh, that looks like it could be related to negligence per se. And so I'd go through and I'd circle everything. And I mean, it was super just like chicken scratch, circle, and then write like the issue could be related to. And then once I got through that, I would then go back through, because once I got to the end, I would then be like, okay, I think these are the different things they're looking for. I'd go through the issues I circled, and then I would start outlining. So I'd be like, okay, this is issue 1, issue 2, issue 3, issue 4. So I'd be like, in a torts one, I'd be like, okay, this is a negligence per se issue where X is suing X, or this is a negligence issue where Y is suing Z, or whatever. And so I'd go through and list those all out, and then I would go and I would start typing. So I would go through and I'd work with the essay, mark it up, find everything, and then I would start typing my answers similarly. Another thing that I think can be helpful, but it's very professor dependent. So I say this knowing that like you have to write, I guess this is another point then entirely, is that you have to write for your professor. Every professor wants you to write a different way. Some are like, I want IRAC, I want a beautiful IRAC. And so if you're doing that, one thing I would do to help get over the writing hump is I would literally write issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. I just write those words, so those headings. So then I could be like, okay, and then I would fill it in. But just having something written on the paper just really helps you get over that freeze of like, what am I doing? How do I start writing? But then some professors are like, I don't want IRAC. Like this is one issue, and I just want you to analyze this one issue, and they just want you to show how your analysis, like that's all they care about. And if that's all they care about, like an IRAC's not going to help you. They might honestly be annoyed if they're like, all this excessive wording that they're not looking for. They're like, yes, of course, that's the issue. There's one issue. So I think you have to like understand what your professor is looking for in their essays and in their like in each question. But I think for an IRAC, it's really helpful to just like write those headings and give yourself like at least something to work off of.
So it sounds like first and foremost, just read the room, understand what your professor is looking for. But then aside from that, y'all seem very similar in that at the very beginning, y'all don't just jump right in. Y'all pause, y'all go through it, issue spot, draft an outline, and by then you have all the tools you need to succeed essentially. And it takes so much of the stress away. I completely relate to that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jake?
I would add just to read the instructions first and foremost.
Yes.
Just because that exam that Kaileigh's talking about, I remember if you breached this very, very limited word count, you got an F automatically. If your professor ever says final exam or hypo or anything along the lines of like this situation that I'm about to talk about could end up being something that you're going to talk about in the final, like our torts final, for example, 1L was just after the asteroid tragedy, and that was literally our torts final. And it was like, okay, we talked about this like several different times throughout the semester, and I thought it was our professor just connecting with current events. Those current events are oftentimes your final, and it's very important.
Law professors love when a current exam,
Right.
current event just presents itself that they can very easily turn into a hypothetical exam.
The only thing I would add on top of all of that is I would say the crux of my focus for how I went about studying for my exams and then actually, writing a long essay is I would put so much emphasis on the rule of law statements, and I would study those over and over ahead of a final. And I think it's important, what I would always do is I would practice writing out rule of law statements. Whatever subject it was, I would just make sure that I was comfortable getting the rules from my brain onto the page so that when it came time to do it for an exam, when it really, really matters, that I was comfortable. I could just put it right onto the page and go right into my analysis. That was something that I put a lot of focus on when I was a 1L.
I think for closed note exams especially, like that is so important. Like being able to just recall and type, because I would do like flashcards for those closed note exams, and flashcards are great, but like you don't need to be able to say it, you need to be able to type it. And so I think translating to being able to type those rules,
Just the muscle memory.
that muscle memory, like it's so helpful. I think that's a great approach.
Yeah. Actually, another really good piece of advice that I got when we were 1Ls was use your facts, because those facts are given to you for a reason, And you can't analyze a situation without talking about how the facts then apply to your rule statement. So being able to look at your exam and say, oh, here's something that I can use to support the conclusion that I've gotten. Oh, here's another thing I can use to support my conclusion. I think that was really huge for me because we do, in studying, focus so much on the rule statements, and they're so pivotal to know that I got a little bit lazy, I think, in the beginning when I was studying and practicing exams with just taking the actual factual situation in the exam itself and bringing that into my answer and supporting why I made the conclusion that I did.
So pivoting from the academic aspect of law school, let's talk about community involvement and the social aspect of it as well, because we are lawyers, we all like to talk a lot, we all like to be right, and it can create an interesting dynamic among your peers. How do you balance, you got student organizations, you got schoolwork, you got your family life. How do you balance all of these things? And how would you recommend one else really, from the outset, not really being super involved, not really knowing, in some cases, what they want to do? How do you suggest they target, organizations that would be better for them or worse?
Yeah, there's so many different groups, and I absolutely agree that, especially fall of 1L, focusing on figuring out how to do law school is much more important than going out and creating your network right away. Obviously, you have your section and you can really lean and trauma bond with the people in your section, which I think we all do. But something that I really had to focus on because I have 2 kids was figuring out how to even do law school and also just have my family. So one thing that was really helpful for me, especially as a second career law student, was treating law school like a job.
And I feel like another good reason to not stretch yourself too thin as a 1L is because at that point, a lot of people don't even know what they're interested in. And that after going through, your entire 1L year, that's when people start to kind of narrow down their interests so that when they become a 2L, that they have a more tailored sense of what organizations they might want to be a part of.
Yeah, the biggest thing is really there's just so much more time. Everything doesn't have to happen the very first semester of law school, even though it can feel that way. You have a ton of different organizations coming at you with information and recruiting activities, and it feels like you have to do it all then. But there's so much more time to get involved. There's so much more time to meet people. And it is really hard to come back from a first semester where you're not creating those good study habits and good reading habits, because if you can create those early on, you get more efficient and you have more time later on to do the personal and relationship stuff.
And that is also the initial organization, right? Section B.
Yeah.
That's how it is. You got 70 people, you're with them every hour of the day, you're all reading the same stuff, watching the same diagrams, answers, same advice from the professors. A lot of it is, it's an organization in and of itself, So one thing that really helped me out when I wanted to make the switch from, I want to be, social guy into academics, I want to go make law review, was mentorship. I don't have any attorneys in my family, and so it was a big adjustment learning what I needed to do to change my life on several different aspects. How do you guys suggest that 1Ls seek mentorship opportunities with older students, professionals, people in the community?
You see, student names in orgs that you're, really interested in, maybe want to get more involved in, send an email. We all have each other's emails. We're much more willing, I think, than 1Ls realize to just chat about our interests and about what we've done. It gives us even a little bit of an opportunity to brag. If you have a firm that you have your heart set on, look and see if you can find other students who have summered at those firms, who might be going to those firms after graduation. Make connections there, because we love talking about our law firms. We chose them for a reason. We are doing things there that we're excited about, and we would love to create that pipeline of UH students in those firms, public interest organizations, whatever it may be. So I think the biggest thing is not being afraid to reach out to people who you don't know and creating your own sort of mentor-mentee relationship that way.
And that detail can be pretty small too. It could be, they're a U of H alum. I'm hi, so-and-so, you graduated from UH Law 2 years ago. I'm new to the city. I go to UH. I'm a 1L. Can we get coffee? I'd like to know about your experience and just get some restaurant tips, you know?
Yeah.
And it's so easy to just send a thank you after like one of those panels, you know? It's thank you, ask a question, boom, they'll answer it typically, or you might have to send a follow-up.
Sure.
But, you know, if someone puts themselves out there directly to 1Ls on like a lunch and learn panel or as a 3L mentor volunteering to help out a group of 1L mentees, you know, they are so in my experience always willing to help you, you know, but it's not on the mentor to initiate that contact. You know, if like I can't help and talk to my 1L mentee group, for example, unless I know what they want to ask me, which is part of the reason why we're doing this podcast right now. And it's so important to just everyone has answered cold calls by now, right? It's you speak in front of a group of people. Sometimes you flub it up. You get better at it as you go. It's just talking to people. Emails are easier because you don't have to talk to anybody. You can just type it. You can read it as many times as you want to. You know, just bite the bullet and do it is my advice.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like really the most important thing you can do is to put yourself in the driver's seat when it comes to mentorship, to reach out to people. And even for mentors that are assigned through the law school, I mean, they'll reach out to you initially, obviously, but you need to take an active role in seeking mentorship from them and not waiting for mentorship, waiting for them to reach out to you. And that's something I didn't really understand at first. I kind of figured my mentors would always be the ones to reach out to me if they wanted to provide me advice, and I had it completely backwards at first. So I think that's an important thing to realize.
I think that's really great advice too, because you might think like, oh, if my mentor's not reaching out to me, it's because like they don't care or they're too busy. But it's not. It's just I think you have to be a little bit more active as a mentee and reach out, because those people do want to help you. But like you said, like they don't know what you like if you need help unless you say something. And then I'm sure they're more than willing to help you. But I think that part of being a mentee is reaching out to the mentor and not expecting them to always come to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because at its core, it's really a growing experience, right? So going on to like employment and why we're here in law school in general, you guys both sampled out litigation. You're both going into litigation. How did you filter out being a transactional lawyer, litigation lawyer? Is it some sort of like proclivity, your personality traits, you know, prior experiences? I know we touched on that a little bit. How did you guys end up picking your firms and practice groups just from the outset of having no information at all?
I think that is really the $1 million question, right? I mean, we come into law school, you kind of have maybe an idea of what it looks like, maybe you don't. And it can feel really intimidating as a 1L to feel like you have to pick what your career looks like for the rest of your life, which you don't. I think there's so much emphasis put on 1Ls, you know, figure out what you want to do. Is it litigation? Is it transaction? You know, it does make a difference based on where you then want to go work. Do you want to be in big law? Do you want to do public interest? Do you want to do some sort of JD Advantage work? You don't have to have it all figured out right away. I think, you know, it's great when people have it done, and that makes a lot of the later decisions easier. But it's also nice to come in with an open mind and figure it out as you're doing it, because I think something that's been super helpful for me, and, you know, I did work at that firm. I was doing transactional work. I tried it out, realized it wasn't for me, and I was able to then move on. So being open to as many opportunities as possible, I think, is really, really helpful in figuring out what your lane is, because while it may not be apparent, like, this is absolutely the thing for me right away, I think it's usually apparent this is not the thing for me. So narrowing it down by trying as many things as possible is really how I found my lane. And like I said, going to panels where attorneys are talking about not just what their practice is, but what drew them to it. That was something that really helped me with the panel that I went to. You know, this litigator was talking about kind of the thrill of putting a puzzle together by doing your research and finding areas of law that really back up your point, and then crafting it into something new for your client, putting it in a nice little, you know, motion or brief and delivering it to a court, and then maybe winning. You know, I'm a very competitive person. So a lot of pitches for transactional work, which might be super compelling to some people, which is like, there is opposing counsel and it's a little adversarial, but at the end of the day, everyone wants the deal to happen, and so everyone's happy because, everyone closed the deal. That's not really compelling for me because I want to win something, which feels a little aggressive, but it's just, I think, knowing your own personalities and what it really is that you want to get out of the job. Another thing about litigation that is really compelling for me is figuring out and solving new problems all the time. So even if you're in, a very specialized area of litigation, like say you want to do labor and employment, you're seeing a lot of very similar things. Maybe you're seeing a lot of discrimination cases, but each one, the facts are different, and each one might be in a different industry. So you're dealing with different types of people, you're dealing with different fact patterns, you're dealing with different very small legal issues that then get, checked boxes into a very big picture, but all of the pictures look different. And that's something that I really, really enjoy, because when things start to look the same for me, I get a little bored. So having something new to learn all the time is really like something that I need in a job to keep me focused, to keep me interested. And I definitely think that litigation is that for me. As far as, the firm goes or where you want to work, something that, again, was really important for me once I figured out that litigation was something I wanted to do was finding a firm that really focused on their litigation practice, because a lot of big firms these days, people don't like to pay for litigation. No one's happy to, on the, at least client side, no one's happy to be involved in litigation. You don't want to be suing someone. You certainly don't want to be the one getting sued. So while, the litigators might be happy they're getting sued because then we have a job, people aren't as willing to pay the big bucks for being in a lawsuit, whereas they obviously want to get a deal done. So there's a lot more money on the corporate transactional side. So a lot of firms lately have been putting a lot of focus on that, which makes sense. But there definitely are, litigation boutiques or big firms that have a really strong foothold on their litigation team and a really strong focus on that. And that was something that I looked for when I was starting to put applications out.
So I took a very different approach because I had no idea what I wanted to do. I came in thinking I wanted to do transactional work, but I just really wasn't sure. And so for me, when I was looking for jobs, like there are some firms, and as you're going through the process, if you're applying for firms, you'll notice that some have you put into a specific practice group. So they're like, okay, great, you've accepted your summer associateship and you will be in the, corporate transactional group. Other firms allow you to rotate through different groups. And so as somebody who had no idea what you wanted to do, the thought of being able to rotate through different groups was really appealing to me. So when I was applying for different firms, I was applying for ones that had the option to go through different groups. And that's what I ended up picking. And so I went through 3 different groups my first summer, and then I came out of it and I still had no idea what I wanted to do. So if you come out of your first summer and you don't know what you want to do, that is totally fine. There's a lot of pressure, like Kaileigh mentioned, to know what you want to do. Like, are you transactional? Are you litigation? People ask you that all the time. It's okay if you don't know. I didn't know until like the middle of my second summer. I then went through 3 new groups my second summer, and I went through the general litigation group because, again, I didn't think I wanted to do litigation, so I didn't go through that group my first summer. I went through it my second summer, and I was like, this is what I want to do. Like, these are the people that I want to work with, and this is the work that I find the most interesting and compelling. Similar to Kaileigh, I like getting to do different things. I like getting to learn different areas. And that's part of what drew me to like the law firm is you get to do lots of different types of cases. And so I liked that in the litigation, in the big law firm, you're getting to do lots of different types of cases and you're learning different types of legal rules and different facts patterns. And so that's one thing that really drew me into litigation. The other thing is, like, I think it's just kind of how my brain works. Like, I was like, I really like the concept of, like, looking through Westlaw. I don't like the concept of looking through Westlaw, but I like the concept of finding that case that just is perfect fit. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is my one perfect case. And that satisfaction is just everything to me. Like, I'm just like, wow, I feel so satisfied right now. I found the case. It applies perfectly. It answers this question. And I was like, I just really enjoy this process. And that's kind of what guided me to pick litigation. But I mean, I'll tell you right now that I'm still not 100% sure that's the right choice, but I'm just going with it right now because it's what feels right. And I think that sometimes that's what you have to do. It's okay if you don't know. It's okay if you're not 100% sure. You can always pivot. So, like, what feels right for you right now, and just, like, do that. Like, if it's what feels right for you in the moment and it's what feels like this is something that I want to do for the next 5 years, do it. And then come back and reevaluate. And, like, you should constantly be reevaluating and, you know, just checking in with yourself. But if it's what makes you happy for the next 3 to 5 years, I say go for it.
Yeah, so much of it is just knowing yourself, figuring out what your goals are, just on a very, like, ethereal level, and then trying as many things as possible to figure out what fits that set. You know, the way that we're described in litigation could make some people, like, absolutely cringe and be like, oh wow, I don't want to do any of that. Like, I was a theater kid growing up, so, like, being in a courtroom, being able to, like, tell a story, that very much speaks to me. I have friends and you know, colleagues who that just makes them want to vomit. And that's fine, you know. I love Westlaw, which I never thought I would say, but I love that. I love digging through that stuff, finding that perfect case, and for a lot of people, that just sounds like the very last thing that they would want to do. So figuring out what it is that really resonates with you and just going after it and trying as many things that you think will fit, I think that's the biggest thing.
It seems that at its core, most importantly, knowing yourself, knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are, but then also making sure that you go out and you seek opportunities and conversations with others that will help you whittle things down. Whether that's going to recruiting receptions or cold calling people to seek mentorship. It's a combination of those two factors, it seems like, that'll help you make that decision.
Yeah, really just being curious about, you know, you don't know what you don't know, and the only way that you're going to find out if a practice group is good for you, or if a subject matter is good for you, or if a firm is even good for you, is whether you go and check them out. Personally, like, I didn't know if I was going to do transaction or litigation until this summer. You know, going into my 3-0 year, I split my summer between a litigation firm and a transactional firm, and I just found that I was so much more comfortable just having all the information in front of me at the transactional firm and being able to just go through all my cross-references, reading all the documents, and just going through and looking at them all individually and following the points that, like, the assignment that I was given, because at the start of your career, especially like a summer associate or an intern, you're not going to be given huge, complicated, very demanding substantive work. It's going to be, you know, gradually leveling up that intensity. And that's how you eventually learn, you get better, and then that's when you graduate to more substantive quality work.
I think one thing that 1Ls tend to struggle with, that I know I certainly struggled with, is distinguishing between different firms, especially in the big law sphere. What's one way that y'all went about when you were going through your job searches, how you did your research on firms, either online or in person at things like receptions? How did you go about distinguishing all these firms, which at first glance look rather similar?
So I had a very specific process, and it worked out. But at the time, I thought I wanted to go into healthcare law and work at a big law firm that had healthcare. I did not, so evidently, and like I said, things can change. You never know what's going to happen, so you always have to keep an open mind. But I thought I wanted to do healthcare, so I went through, like, the Vault Top 100 law firms. I looked at NALP, and I just started looking, like, which law firms have a good presence in Texas, have a good presence in Houston, because those were things that were important to me. Some people are like, oh, I want one that's, like, a really big national firm. I, however, was like, I think I want a firm that has a really big Houston office. So I was looking at the size of the Houston office. I was looking at what practice groups they had. Do they have a healthcare practice? And I had a spreadsheet, and I just, like, wrote each firm. Do they have these different things? I was also looking at, like, do they have direct apply versus OCI, which we might get into a little bit more. But essentially, like, November 1st, you can apply directly to firms, but then we have on-campus interviews with firms also in, like, January. So I included that in my spreadsheet. Like, are they participating in OCI? Are they a direct apply? And I just kind of narrowed down the firms that way by seeing, like, do they have the practice groups? Do they have the size? And then I would go to the different networking events. Sadly, we did not have very many because of COVID. They canceled most of our networking events. So I went to 2, I believe, and one of them was B&E, where I ended up. So I think that the networking events are very critically important. Like figuring out like, do I like these people? So I went to the networking event, met with some great people, and then I ended up getting coffee and talking on the phone with like 3 other people throughout the semester that I was able to connect with who were at the firm, and just kind of get a feel of, do I like the people who are working here? Because at the end of the day, the work is fairly similar, especially across big law firms. There are some differences, like some firms have a bigger litigation group, like Fulbright does, and some might have a bigger like corporate transactional group, but it's still pretty similar work. So I think it's just figuring out, like, do I like these people? Like, these specific people, do I get along with? Would I want to socialize with them? Would I want to be working with them until 2 a.m.? It's kind of just a vibe check. Like, do I vibe well with these people?
I agree. I also had a spreadsheet.
Same.
Which,
Yeah.
I think, especially not knowing the Texas legal market, you know, I came in from New England. I had no idea about the firms here. You know, some of the firms that have names in, you know, the Boston area where I was before have names here, but a lot of it's different. And so it can be super overwhelming to try and figure out kind of what the vibes are. You know, if you have people who are in those firms that you know, you do have a better idea. I just was coming in, I thought at least, completely blind. So it felt super intimidating, which is, I think, why I started to put the spreadsheet together, because rather than, you know, just looking, you know, clicking through websites, it was just, here are all the things that I think are important to me. Let me quantify them in this order and then figure out from there how this fits into my application process, and let me start doing some more legwork to figure out what those vibes really are for me. And then something, once I started my interviews, that I really used to separate the firms that I vibed with and didn't, was because the interview process can be super long and exhausting. You know, you go through these callback interviews, you might meet with, you know, 6 to 10 different attorneys. By the end of it, you know, I definitely had firms where I was just absolutely exhausted, and you're putting up a front, at least it felt like to me, for those firms, and that's why you get so tired at the end of it, because you're trying to be something that maybe you're not. And the firms that once I got through the process and I was just super excited and energized by, and like, hey, maybe I don't even, like, if you don't hire me, that's fine, can we be friends? Like, that's how I felt after a different number of firms. So that really helped guide me as well, because I was like, if I'm working with you all the time, I want to be able to be friends with you as well. You know, we don't have to go and get coffee and tea and drinks every day, but we're going to be spending a lot of time together ostensibly. So I want to make sure that you're not absolutely draining my energy, but you're keeping it up.
Also, I utilized Paul in the CDO. He was very helpful. So when I was narrowing it down to like a couple of firms, and I was like, it's difficult to make the decision, you know, the firms, I see pros to a couple different firms, I called Paul and I just talked to him at like 6 p.m. like during like the winter break, and I was like, help. And he gave me his honest feedback on the firms, and that was really helpful. Like, they've worked with these firms for years, and they know, like, a lot about the firms. They know a lot about the people at the firms. And he was just like, honestly, like, this is what I think of some of those firms. It's like, this is what I needed to hear, and it was so helpful. So also utilizing the CDO as well.
A lot of people that they know, like the CDO knows at these firms, are also former students as well. And so they can tell, you know, having worked with some associate, you know, 4 years ago, if you will get along with them just by their experiences. You know, they have so much just valuable knowledge that it's super important to reach out and just connect with them and get their thoughts on your resume, cover letters, do a mock interview so you know at least what to be prepared for when you've got someone that is analyzing your ability to speak with them. You know, figure out what you want to say, how to say it correctly, and more importantly, not to say anything that's really going to negatively impact your application.
Yeah, I think this is where establishing those mentor-mentee relationships early on can be critical.
Right.
Because as even maybe like you're coming in like me, where you don't know anybody in Houston, and you can't be like, hey, do we know somebody at this firm? Just I didn't know anybody in the city at all. Being able to go to upperclassmen, you know, we all know other classmates that we have who are in just about every single area of law in the city possible. You know, I have friends who have worked with the district attorney's office, with the public defender's office, with different judges who are clerking, who are in big law, who are in smaller litigation boutiques, who are in, you know, mid-sized firms. We all go to different places, and we all have friends who are in different places. So just reaching out to somebody that is either your assigned mentor, a TA, we're all willing to say, oh, who do I know who, you know, maybe I don't have the exact experience you're looking for, you don't want to come work where I work, but I know someone who works somewhere that sounds like what you want to do. So I can definitely hook you up with that person, and they can share their experience, and they can introduce you to other people who are in that line of work.
Mm-hmm. It really is just of paramount importance to have interactions with people who either currently are or have been at these firms that you might be looking at. There's really just no way around that, no replacement for that kind of research, that soft data that you get, the vibe checks on these kinds of firms.
Right.
And you also touched on something a little bit earlier that I wanted to highlight, which is that throughout the interview process, I mean, it's really a two-way street, and I don't think that many people, or some people might not appreciate that.
Yeah.
And it's not just about them feeling you out, it's just as much about you feeling them out. And I think that's something that it's important to not lose sight of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is your career. You know, you really have to own it, and you have to figure out what it's going to look like and why you want it to look that way. I had someone my 1L year make this analogy, which maybe some people won't get, but if you watch The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, you know, you kind of have to take this approach where you are, you know, the Bachelorette, the Bachelor, and you're figuring out who to give your final rose to. And, you know, you're kind of dating around, you have a one-on-one, you have a group date, you do whatever, you know, in these different networking situations. But at the end of the day, it's really you making that decision. And these firms want you because you have a unique set of skills, and you have a really marketable quality now. And so not just trying to be what you think the firm wants, but making sure the firm is something that you want.
Yeah.
It's a shockingly accurate analogy. I feel like I'd never thought of it like that, but
I think that works so perfectly.
Yeah, that's something I tell all of my mentees or, you know, younger students who are going through that process. I'm like, I know it feels like so much pressure to be whatever it is that, you know, whoever, it may not be a firm, whether it's a judge or whoever it is that you're interviewing with, that you're the perfect candidate. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but you also need to make sure, because this is going to be where you are potentially, that it's right for you.
Well, Kaileigh and Chandni, thank you so much for joining us today. We think that there have been so many great tips that the 1Ls can take advantage of that have been discussed here today. I think it's hard to be a 1L at times, and I think that hopefully this episode will give them the tools that they need to be better off than they were yesterday, perhaps.
Seriously, I mean, I learned a lot as a 3L. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm sure that there's so much knowledge. Thank you so much for your time, guys. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're happy to help out. You know, I think we all remember how daunting it can feel as a 1L, and just 1 to 2 years later, you have so much more experience, so much more knowledge. It's kind of hard to imagine that you can know the things I think that we know now that we wished we knew as, you know, fall 1L students. So it's really nice to be able to share that.
Going through 1L is such a unique experience, and so like once we've done it, like I want to pass that on to the next group. Like, what's the point of all this knowledge and everything I've learned if we don't share it with like the next generation, the next group of people going through? So, you know, I'm happy to share any and all advice if it can help one person.
Yeah, and anyone else who are watching, if they want to reach out to us, I think we're more than happy to continue conversations.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you all again so much for joining us today.
Thanks for listening. Emphasis Added is a podcast brought to you by the Houston Law Review. If you like what you see, check us out on Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast streaming app for new content when it drops.
Follow us on Instagram at EmphasisAddedPod, or check out the Law Review at HoustonLawReview.org.